In this lesson, we will discuss subtracting fractions using formal rules. The main thing to remember is that when we add or subtract fractions, we need a common denominator. We need a common denominator because we need to add or subtract pieces or parts of the same size. So for review, to add or subtract fractions, step 1, if the fractions do not have a common denominator, determine the least common denominator, or LCD, or at least a common denominator. The LCD is the least common multiple of the denominators. Step 2, write each fraction as an equivalent fraction with the LCD or common denominator. 3, add or subtract the fractions by adding or subtracting the numerators and keeping the common denominator the same. And then step 4, we simplify the fraction if possible. So going back to our examples, here we have 5/8 minus 1/8. So the first thing to recognize is that we do have a common denominator of 8, which means the parts or pieces are the same size. 5/8 minus 1/8 means we have 5 copies of 1/8 and we're subtracting 1 copy of 1/8. So to find the difference, we subtract the numerators. 5 minus 1 is equal to 4. The denominator remains 8. So the difference is 4/8, but the fraction 4/8 is not simplified because 4 and 8 share a common factor of 4. One way to simplify the fraction is to divide the numerator and denominator by 4. Well, 4 divided by 4 is equal to 1, and 8 divided by 4 is equal to 2. The simplified difference is 1/2. If we don't recognize that 4 and 8 share a common factor of 4, another way to simplify fractions is to write the numerator and denominator in prime factored form. Notice 4 is equal to 2 times 2, and the prime factorization of 8 is 2 times 2 times 2. Notice how we can see 4 and 8 share a common factor of 4, or 2 factors of 2. 2 divided by 2 is equal to 1 here as well as here, leaving us with the simplified fraction of 1/2. Next we have 11/12 minus 7/12. Again, notice how we already have a common denominator of 12, which means the parts or pieces are already the same size. 11/12 minus 7/12 means 11 copies of 1/12 minus 7 copies of 1/12. So to find the difference, we subtract the numerators. 11 minus 7 is equal to 4. The denominator remains 12. So the difference is 4/12, but again, this is not simplified because 4 and 12 share a common factor of 4. One way to simplify the fraction is to divide the numerator and denominator by 4. 4 divided by 4 is equal to 1, and 12 divided by 4 is equal to 3. The simplified difference is 1/3. Another way to show the simplification of 4/12 is to write the prime factorization of 4, which is 2 times 2, over the prime factorization of 12, which is 2 times 2 times 3. Simplifying, 2 divided by 2 is equal to 1 here as well as here, giving us a simplified fraction of 1/3. Next we have 2/3 minus 1/2. Notice for this difference, we do not have a common denominator, and therefore the pieces or parts are not the same size. So step 1 is to determine the least common denominator, or at least a common denominator. And we'll do this by listing multiples of 3 and multiples of 2. Multiples of 3 are 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, and so on. Multiples of 2 are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and so on. Looking at the two lists, notice how 6 is a common multiple of 2 and 3, and so is 12. But because 6 is the smallest common multiple, or least common multiple, 6 is the least common denominator, which means we'll write both 2/3 and 1/2 as equivalent fractions with a denominator of 6. If we ever have a hard time determining a common denominator, we can always multiply the two denominators to determine a common denominator. It won't always give the least common denominator, but it will always give a common denominator. Notice in this case, 2 times 3 equals 6, which does happen to be the LCD. To write 2/3 as an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 6, we multiply the numerator and denominator by 2, because 3 times 2 is equal to 6. To write 1/2 as an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 6, we multiply the numerator and denominator by 3, because 2 times 3 is equal to 6. So notice that 2/3 is equivalent to 4/6, and 1/2 is equivalent to 3/6. Now that we have a common denominator, the pieces are the same size, and we can determine the difference. We subtract the numerators. 4 minus 3 is equal to 1. The denominator remains the same. The difference is 1/6. 1/6 is simplified because the only common factor between 6 and 1 is 1. For the last example, we have 3/4 minus 2/5. Again, notice how we do not have a common denominator, so the first step is to determine the least common denominator, or at least a common denominator. So we'll go ahead and list multiples of 4 and 5. Multiples of 4 are 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, and so on. Multiples of 5 are 5, 10, 15, 20, and so on. Notice the least common multiple of 4 and 5 is 20, which means 20 is the least common denominator. Also notice how 4 times 5 is equal to 20, which also gives us the LCD. Again, the product of the denominators will always give us a common denominator, but not always the least common denominator. For the next step, we write 3/4 and 2/5 as equivalent fractions with a denominator of 20. To write 3/4 as an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 20, we multiply the numerator and denominator by 5, because 4 times 5 is equal to 20. To write 2/5 as an equivalent fraction with a denominator of 20, we multiply numerator and denominator by 4, because 5 times 4 is equal to 20. So 3/4 is equivalent to 15/20, and 2/5 is equivalent to 8/20. Now that we have a common denominator, we know the parts or pieces are the same size, and we can determine the difference. Subtracting the numerators, 15 minus 8 is equal to 7, and the denominator remains 20. The only common factor between 7 and 20 is 1, and therefore this difference is simplified. The difference equals 7/20. And this should make sense. 15/20 minus 8/20 equals 7/20 means 15 copies of 1/20 minus 8 copies of 1/20 equals 7 copies of 1/20. I hope you found this helpful.